So my particular topic is to discuss direct visual perception in remote viewing. And so anytime I'm talking about visuals, I'm talking about the actual application of seeing some piece of information directly, just like you would see in real life. Now, there are levels to quality of what that looks like, and I'm going to discuss that. But I just want you to understand when I say visual, I'm always saying you're literally seeing the target, because in many instances with remote viewing protocols, training, this is not something that's talked about, stressed, really deeply kind of communicated to people. So, and this particular topic is for the beginner. So this is focused on what would a beginner who can see information visually directly, how would it come through? And this is what this is going to talk about. When we look at the scientific community in terms of inducing visuals within the minds of subjects, they use typically two approaches. And you can find a bunch of papers published on this information, but they use either a Ganzfeld approach, which is the absence of visual stimulation, or a Ganzflicker approach, which is more like overwhelming your visual senses. So one's kind of overwhelming visually, the other one is the absence of visual. So with the Ganzfeld, typically you could be in a completely pitch black room as an example, but typically people will just close their eyes or they'll use a blindfold, something of that nature, to essentially stop any kind of input into the eyes. For Ganzflicker, it's typically done open-eyed because you actually want to see the light flickers, and this creates kind of this overstimulation. You typically wear like frosted glasses or ping pong balls. In the old days, in the 60s, they would wear ping pong balls, and you're being hit by like different colored lights essentially to create the effect, and the light comes through the kind of frosted lenses, so you can't actually see anything that you can make out because that would be a distraction visually, but you get hit by the light. So these are the two approaches that are used to induce by the scientific community. And of course, I should add that with the Ganzflicker, if you're photosensitive, epilepsy, there's all sorts of, possibilities that are not good. So, I am not recommending this. I'm just sharing my own experiences and kind of this information. Seek out your own doctor, professional, before you choose the Ganzflicker route. I personally used it without any issues, but I can't speak for everybody, so I'm just throwing that out as a disclaimer. But in terms of like, what are the differences between the two? Well, scientifically, when they've studied this, the papers kind of talk about the Ganzflicker tends to bring on the visual stimulation faster, and the Ganzfeld the imagery tends to hold longer. So like the flicker tends to produce images faster. The Feld tends to, when they are produced, they tend to hold steady a little bit longer. This is according to the scientific studies. I would say like in the beginning stages, that's kind of correct. But then if you train with these over a period of time, you get more familiar, and the differences between the two become less. So you can get the effects on both sides of the fence, depending on your experience, is what I would kind of say. The other thing that is interesting about this, and I need to circle back to another point, but another thing that's interesting about the Ganzflicker is that the flicker rate is actually in the alpha state. And the optimal flicker rate, I think, is around 10 hertz, but there's a range. And what I find very fascinating about this is that Persinger, who's a scientist who worked with Ingo Swann, who's a famous remote viewer, they studied Ingo Swann when he had EEG on his head, and he would get very accurate data about the target. Persinger would study his brain, and there was one part of his brain that went into the alpha state when he was getting good data. So I find it somewhat interesting that the flicker rate that's more optimal to produce these visual stimulations for a person with the flicker is in the alpha state. Okay, so then let me circle back. So my experiences with the flicker is that I've used it successfully to stimulate my mind, and it does come on faster. The visuals do come on faster, in my opinion, than the Ganzfeld approach. But I've used it prior to session work to kind of stimulate the brain so that the visual areas are kind of like warmed up. And then I've gone straight in with the protocols and done normal sessions using more of a Ganzfeld approach. And I've been able to get good visuals right on the first page. And I really do think that approach is highly successful for visual imagery. My experience with the Ganzfeld, I use a mask with open eyes, and I tested this years ago for quite a while, and I tested it both closed-eyed with a mask on and just closed-eyed with a mask off, the same thing, or open-eyed with a mask on. Open-eyed worked better, and in my opinion, The reason it worked better is because when our eyes are open, we are conditioned to expect that we will see real life visuals. And so what I noticed was that the visual clarity of my work went up significantly more when I did that. But when I closed my eyes, I got more memory, imagination, kind of level quality imagery. Like there was a very distinct difference between the two. I could see it. And I believe that that is the reason why that occurred in my case. And I suspect that would work for others. Okay, so the relevance of visuals, like Sasha kind of talked about this in her topic discussion as well. You can get visuals that are conceptual. So when we say direct visual perception, people typically a beginner is going to assume like, oh, okay, I see the photograph, I see the target, I see the person. Well, yes, that is true. But you can also see other information that is not that you can see a conceptual form of information as an example. In one of my sessions, I got the skull with the wings. I saw that very clearly. And this was a conceptual representation in that particular session of a transference between realities, dimensions, realms. This was like something, it was sonoluminescence. So it was like this light appears in the scientific experiment in water. It looks like a star in a jar out of nowhere. And this was essentially saying this thing is moving from a higher level down to our level. And this was a conceptual piece of information. But it came through as a visual. So like if you made the assumption that everything you see is literal, you just assume like, oh, that's what that was. And then when you see the target sonoluminescence, you'd be like, oh, that was a mess. No, it was good data. So the point here I'm trying to make that's important is that your visual data can be a range of information and it can be very relevant, even if it's not literal. So you can get symbolic, like the dollar sign. You can get similes where you can get like comparisons or relationships between information that's actually presented to you as a visual. Or you can get on the far right, which Sasha showed in her session as well, I got the squid from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I got the mouth, and I saw that literal. So that's wonderful too. The other point here is just to say that the military, I think from what I've seen, their emphasis is always on the literal, right? But exactly what Sasha said, we have found these other forms of information are super powerful. So like, I would just say that the mindset of the community is skewed much more towards literal. That cuts out a lot of the value of the data that you can actually collect if you only want to look at it through that lens. Okay, visual quality. So as a beginner, like what should you expect to see? And I'm only speaking from my experiences. I believe strongly that a lot of this is probably going to be seen by a majority of people, but I could be wrong, but I'm only using myself as a reference point. So you can see simple line drawings. So you'll see black or white, as the background, and then you'll see the opposite for the lines. And so in the case on the left here, we have the open mouth. This came in through a session that was focused on Wim Hof, and the person wanted to know, how does Wim Hof do the feats that this individual is able to do? And the individual uses specific breathing techniques, and that was the answer. He breathes, and exactly what he says he's doing to get his results is exactly correct. That's what, in my mind, this is what this information was communicated to me through a line drawing of an open mouth, which is an indication of movement of air, and it came through as a simple line drawing. But a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I mean, that piece of information is super useful compared to a list of adjectives where you're trying to understand how that information correlates to the target. The next level that it can come in is in these sort of 2D color or shadowy kind of forms. And as best I can, I'm actually literally trying to show you what I see in my mind. And it's not perfect, but it's a reasonable approximation. So I will see things that look like particles or haze or hazy clouds or shadows. Basically these forms, they first started out as gray forms, black and white is how they first were introduced to me. And these forms kind of shift and move around. And, like in the bottom one, you're looking at it and you go like, well, I see it. I think it's a house. It might have 2 windows. That's really all you can really say about it. It's difficult to make much more of a conclusion than that. When you get color into those, then you can start to say like, oh, okay, yeah, it's definitely a house. Like the color kind of brings out enough value that it's much easier for you to tell that it's clearly a house, the color of the house and things of that nature, but it's still two-dimensional, still flat. It's still difficult to kind of make out what it is. So then the shadows move to 3D forms. both black and white and color. And this is sort of stage 2. When this happens, it becomes much easier, again, still difficult, but I'm saying much easier than it was previously to see things like the depth. The spatial depth comes in. So now when you see something that looks like a house and you see the length of the house, you're like, aha, that's a house or a barn or something like that. You can tell the shape of it proportionally. You may be able to estimate distances. You can clearly see that there's 2 windows. Like that for sure is very clear to you now. You may be able to pick up a chimney or some other artifacts around the house. You can definitely tell the siding. Like on 2D, I can't tell the siding of things. Like, is it wood siding? Is it planks? Is it brick? Like, it's very difficult to tell. But when it moves into 3D, all of a sudden you get enough depth where this stuff starts to pop out. And of course, with color, under the same conditions, it gets even easier. Then you'll start to move into things that are more photographic. These can range from photographs, movies, real life, even beyond real life in different aspects. And they can be fuzzy, they can be clear, they can come in all sorts of different forms. But essentially, when you move into this stage, it gets much easier to articulate details. You start to quickly be able to communicate higher levels of information when you get to this level of visual. Because I've had a lot of psychic spiritual experiences, and spontaneously you can have, in those experiences, you can have things like 360-degree vision, as an example. And you have to understand that when you're doing these things, your eyes are not real. You're not using your real eyes. So technically speaking, you can go beyond the limitations of them because you're not being bound by physical constraints. So I bring this up because it's possible to have abnormalities in these situations when you're trying to remote view that might match things that happen spontaneously with normal psychic type of activities. Yeah, it's just a point I'm going to make. So you can move through these ranges as a beginner, usually kind of line to shadowy or clouds or static or pixels or something like dots, things of that nature, to more photographic, which can have motion and all sorts of stuff. What are some of the additional considerations with visuals? When you start developing yourself with these visuals, there are other things that can start to happen. You can get downloads, and the download will be like a burst of visuals that you get, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 visuals, just boom, one right after another. Most of the time, these visuals, as a beginner, they are fast. They're usually like a second or two. And so when you get these downloads, you might have like 2 seconds or 3 seconds or even a second and a half, and you literally just get like bombarded with these images. So that's possible. There are other levels to this as well beyond downloads, but I'm not sure I really want to talk about it right now in terms of my experiences. I haven't heard anybody else in the community talk about it, so I'm not sure if it's how common it is. But another very well-known level of sort of visual is by location, where you feel that you're at the target, where your remote viewing is so good, you magically sort of, in some way, shape, or form, appear at the target in a way that is more immersive, as if you were in real life kind of a thing. You can go to that level. So I bring this up because all of my bilocations that I've had have occurred as a result of a visual. And I say this because I feel it's an important piece of information. I'm quite certain you can have a bilocation that has nothing to do with you trying to directly perceive visually the target. However, I suspect that by training yourself to see visuals directly, you will increase the percentage chance of bilocation happening because it's one step closer to actually being physically at the site. The other thing I would say is that just like with the conceptual information that you can get at the earlier stages that I talked about a couple slides back, this can happen with bilocation because I've experienced it. So it's like you can be at the site and it can seem very real, but it's not actually the target, like, oh, you're at the person's house or whatever. No, you're getting conceptual information and you're immersed into that information at a level that's so extreme that it actually seems like you're at that environment, whatever that thing conceptually looks like. But technically, it's still just conceptual data. So this is another thing that I experienced that I thought I might mention. Last slide, I believe. So how could you maybe approach this and increase your visual capacity? Like, what are some of the ways, if you start to engage in this process and it's challenging, which it will be, like how could you maybe improve this? Well, one of them is visual memory exercises. There's computer games, things of that nature. But there's one exercise that's interesting where you either use a complex photo, which I've shown here as an example of the photo, and then below is sort of my sketch from the photo. Or you could go to storefronts. So you could go to like a complex strip mall or something, walk up to the building, someplace you've never been to before, look in the store, and give yourself like 2 seconds. The same thing for the photo, the same exercise, just using photo or real life, but it's like 2 seconds. You then go back to your car. If it was at the store, you go back to your car, you sit down and you try to sketch and write down words and ideas and sketches and like everything that you possibly remember in that 2 seconds. Same thing for the photo, as best you can. So this practice will help to increase the likelihood that you're able to transcribe the information that you see visually during these remote viewing sessions. The other thing that I found to be utterly fascinating, maybe everybody else will be bored to tears, and that's okay, I get it. But for me, because it helped with my work as well, I found mind-blowing to me was when I would sketch the results for this, which I have an example down below, I could start to actually see my biases. I could actually start to map these out. I could actually start to see where my mind or memory is faulting and where it's very good. And like as an example on this one, there's a woman in a dress, yellow dress, bright yellow dress right at the front. I'm a guy, everything else in the photo could be gone. I'm gonna remember that. So it's like, I got that detail very well down in my sketch, right? But I also got the guy at the front very, very well. I got that there was a stand he was next to, which was correct. I got the positions correct. And basically what I can tell from this is like the foreground stuff, I'm able to grab a hold of that detail pretty well. When you push back, the detail starts to fall away a bit more. I can also start to look at the gestalts of the buildings and figure out which pieces I resonate with more than others. So you might see, triangles or rectangles or circles or ovals or something in a picture for structures. For whatever reason, you tend to grab those, but you have more difficult time with other aspects. Or like in the case of this one, this example down here, which you probably can't see very well, but there's a red chair in that photo on the right down towards the side. I got red scooter. So I got something that was a similar size, correct color, correct position, but they're both objects, but I got the wrong object. So this is where you can kind of check yourself and go like, oh, interesting. Like there was one case where there was a girl that was like 14 or something, and she was carrying flowers, and I sketched that she had a purse on the correct arm and everything, because it's like I knew she had something there, but I took a guess, and then my bias came in. Right. This is a way for you to really study your own mind, how it works, and you can get a feeling for when your data is a maybe versus a more solid thing through this process on the paper. And so when you do your session work, you can start to make it easier for you to go like, yeah, I'm pretty confident of this piece, not so much. The last thing here is if you record your dreams, if you wake up, write your dreams down and improve that memory process for remembering visually the information that came in through your dreams. And I think I know why this works, the mechanism for it, but you should see your results improve through the remote viewing process, these visuals as well. And you can test it for yourself. I could be wrong, but if you do, let me know your feedback on this. But I believe that based on my own experiences, what you should see is you'll see it becomes easier for you to hold more data in these remote viewing visual flashes than it would be otherwise. And then here's some citations from some of the stuff that I referenced. And that was the last piece of data is when you look at these scientific studies, which are amazing to look at, they give you some clues as to how things work and how they might relate to remote viewing and visuals that you pull in remote viewing. Understand one key thing, because I have seen where some of the stuff is accurate and some of it is not from my experiences. The subjects are not using intent during these sessions. They're usually very passive. They're not active. Remote viewing is very actively, aggressively trying to get visual data. This is a difference that is not introduced into these scientific papers. And so you have to kind of weigh that in and understand that there could be variances that don't apply to remote viewing and some that do because of this delta. And then there's my disclaimer, and I think that is it. Any questions?
I do. In terms of the Ganzfeld and Ganzflicker approaches that you discussed, do you do those just as experiments on the side, or do you integrate that in your remote viewing session work often? Or do you do your remote viewing session and then you do that on the side at another time? Or was that just for experiments and now you just do that during your session just with your eyes closed?
Yeah, so I have used them experimentally to understand better deeper understandings. But yeah, I definitely use them both at different times for session work. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, they're both scientifically, you can see it just from the papers. It's a tried true method to inducing visuals, and it works. So yeah, absolutely, it's part of my process.
A question when it comes to developing more visual detail, like acuity with like color and like dimensionality and so on. I was wondering what in your experience has been like the overall kind of latency between those different phases, or what kind of things depends on that.
Yeah, so as a beginner, my first visuals were line drawings. Primarily, that's all I got for maybe the first 3-6 sessions practice sessions that I was doing when I first started kind of trying to do this, through this process, through the methods and stuff. But then it moved, after that, it moved into the 2D gray shadowy stuff, and that lasted for maybe, I would say, like it became a mix between the line and the shadow visuals would come in over the next like 20 sessions or something. And during some time during there, I started to get color as well. And I would say after maybe 20 sessions, roughly 30 sessions, somewhere in there, then I started to get more photographic color type of communications. And so from that point forward, it was a mix of any of those three. I would say typically I get today, it seems like it tends to be either line drawing or like photo level stuff, which when I say that, it's a range, right? So it's not necessarily super clear or exactly like a photo, but it's not the shadowy stuff and it's not line drawing. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.